The king doesn't wait for strays!
Don't. They shoot runners in the spine. You'd live. That's the point. I wasn't going to run. Everyone's gonna run, right up until they see him. The Alpha King? They told us stories about this place, about him. They said he hadn't spoken in open court for 3 years, that he'd gone cold after the war, that nothing moved him anymore. The stories were wrong about one thing.
The borders are secure, and the Watch remains vigilant. But if the shadows return to the north, we must...
No. Mine. Kale.
She is mine.
Iron cuffs bit into my wrists as the hall doors slammed open. 14 of us dragged inside, mud still clinging to our boots. No one spoke. Then the Alpha King stood, not slowly, not carefully, like something had just snapped. His head lifted and locked onto me. 30 feet away, and I felt it. A pull, violent, immediate. My knees almost gave out. No, I whispered, breath catching as his scent hit me. Cedar, winter, something warm underneath. Mine. He crossed the hall, not looking at anyone else. Not the council, not the woman beside his throne. Just me, every step heavier, faster, until he stopped right in front of me. His hand lifted, like he already knew me, like he remembered something I didn't. And then, in a voice that shattered the entire room, "She is mine." The court erupted. But I couldn't move, because the way he was looking at me wasn't just recognition. It was like he'd been waiting for me. If you love intense alpha stories, the kind with real emotion, real tension, then trust me, you're going to want to stay for this. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps more than you think. Packless wolves don't get fated mates. I decided that at 16. Standing at the edge of a road with everything I owned on my back, and no one coming after me. Not to drag me back, not to make sure I was safe. I had broken the law of the pack, the deepest one, and they had answered the way packs always answer things they cannot forgive. They let me go, which was the polite version of, "We do not know you anymore." It had been a boy, an enemy wolf, half dead in a barn my pack intended to deal with before morning. I had let him out instead. He was gone by first light. I was gone by midday. 7 years of moving because of it. I had never found a way to forgive myself entirely. I had also never found a way to believe I had been wrong, which is why the moment his scent hit me, I almost went down. They didn't look at me when they took me. No trial, no warning. Just soldiers stepping out of the tree line, iron cuffs snapping around my wrists, and 14 packless wolves being herded through the mud before the sun had finished rising. I had 3 speeches ready before they'd finished binding my hands. A healer's assistant, a merchant's runner, a trader's scout moving goods between the northern posts. 3 versions, each one adjusted for whoever was doing the arresting. None of them had started in iron cuffs. But I was adaptable. The Gonzales fortress rose from the hillside like something the land had grown on purpose. Dark stone, iron, centuries of authority stacked so high it blocked the morning sky. Banners the color of deep wine and charcoal gray hung from the towers, enormous and still. The gates were standing wide open, which was worse than locked. Locked gates are a warning. Open ones are confidence, the kind that says, "Nothing that walks in here leaves without permission." There were 14 of us in the sweep. An older man who hadn't raised his eyes from the ground. A girl my age who hadn't stopped crying, which I understood but couldn't afford to join. And me. I kept my chin up. That is what you learn when you've been on your own since 16. You keep your chin up and your eyes clear and your mouth ready, because in this world a packless wolf is only as safe as she is useful. The great hall announced itself with stone arches and torchlight, and the weight of banners marking every alliance the kingdom had decided was worth remembering. Warriors lined both walls, still in the way of men who have made stillness into a threat. A council of robed figures watched us enter with the flat expression of people who had processed enough of these situations to have stopped finding them interesting. Pack law and court politics lived side by side here, the way things live together when they've had long enough to work out the arrangement. The air smelled like wood smoke and old stone, and the cold that comes from a room that has held power for a very long time. And underneath all of it, pulling at something below my ribs, cedar. Winter pine, warm underneath both. My knees buckled. Not a stumble, not a trip on the stone. A real, genuine buckle, the kind where the bones in your legs simply stop cooperating without consulting the rest of you. I caught myself. My hand shot out and grabbed the arm of the gray-haired man beside me. He startled. I released him, straightened my shoulders, and stared hard at the floor tiles. Good. No one said anything. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais, court was already in session. The Alpha King sat in a carved chair that stopped just short of being a throne. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, his hair pulled back as a practical decision. No crown. Fine clothes, nothing added to them. He had the look of a man who had been making hard decisions since before he was fully grown, and had simply never stopped. His eyes were on the parchment in his hands. Beside him stood a woman, embroidered velvet deep blue, hair arranged so perfectly it might have been sculpted. Chin lifted at an angle she'd practiced until it felt natural. She was watching us file in with the expression of someone who had already written her opinion, and was waiting for reality to confirm it. I noticed the way she stood near him. Not beside him, near. Like proximity was a claim she was making quietly, without a word. I moved on, focused. 3 speeches. Pick one. The hall was humming with ordinary court noise, and then it was not. The silence spread from the dais outward, starting with the man on the chair. He lifted his head, and across 30 feet of stone floor and torchlight and smoke, his eyes found mine. I opened my mouth, the healer's assistant version. 2 words in. And then his scent arrived, and the world went very still. I know what mates are. I've known my whole life the way you know about things you've decided aren't for you. 2 wolves recognizing each other across whatever space separates them. Instant, undeniable. The scent, the pull, the knowledge arriving before the thought does. Not for people like me. I had decided that at 16. Packless wolves do not get fated mates. We get ourselves, and that is enough. I had been entirely fine with that conclusion until approximately 11 seconds ago, when the scent of cedar and winter pine hit me in the chest like a door swung open in a gale, and everything I thought I knew about my own life rearranged itself in the space of one breath. He set the parchment down. He stood. He walked off the dais, and something happened in his face when he got close, something I wasn't prepared for. Not just the bond, something older than that. His eyes moved over mine and stilled, and for a fraction of a second he looked like a man who has just seen something he recognized from a long time ago. Like he was arriving at a conclusion he'd already been carrying. I didn't know what that meant. I filed it away and held my ground. The entire court watched him cross the hall. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the guards who had marched us in seemed to have forgotten they had a job to do. The woman in the embroidered velvet had gone very still at the edge of the dais. Not stillness. The precise management of a reaction she couldn't afford to show. He stopped in front of me. Up close he was more. Taller than he'd looked on the dais. Eyes dark brown, completely steady. Like a man who has looked at something and made a decision and is not interested in revising it. The bond between us was humming so loudly I was surprised it didn't have a sound. He looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I had to hold myself still by force. Then he looked at his court, at his council, at the woman in the embroidered velvet. And he said, She is mine. 2 words. The most casually earth-shattering 2 words I'd ever heard. The court reacted the way rooms react when something enormous and irreversible has just happened. Someone dropped something metal. Council members exchanged looks that contained entire conversations. And somewhere near the dais, a sound I did not look toward, small and controlled, from the woman who had been standing so carefully still. I did not look at her. Andres was looking at me, only at me, with the expression of a man who has just found something he intends to be very careful with. I haven't agreed to that. Someone in the court made a sound like they were trying hard not to choke. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. "No," he said, "you haven't." He did not look concerned about this. And still, underneath the composure I was holding on to by my fingernails, a part of me kept asking the question I didn't want to ask. Would any of this be happening if not for the bond? Is this him or is this the moon? I didn't know. And not knowing made it harder to accept any of it. My name is Zoe, 23 years old. I'd talked my way out of 7 territories, 4 holding cells, and 1 very uncomfortable standoff with a Border Patrol commander who had extremely firm opinions about documentation. I had walked into this hall with 3 speeches about how useful I could be. Not one of them had accounted for this. His eyes were steady on me, and I was aware, painfully and inconveniently, that whatever I'd walked in intending to do had already changed. The speeches were gone. The exit plans were gone. The careful distance I kept between myself and anything I wasn't prepared to lose had just taken a direct hit, and I hadn't even said a word yet. I didn't know what came next, but behind me the woman in embroidered velvet was watching with a smile arranged perfectly on her face, and when Andres turned back toward the dais, she stepped forward. The look she gave me over his shoulder was not the smile at all. It was a warning, the kind that meant she'd already started.
The air changed before I understood why. Not a sound, not a movement. A change, the way a room changes when a fire goes out. One moment the hall was exactly what it had always been. The next it was different, and the difference was a scent, cedar warm, clean, and underneath it, arriving not as a thought but as a fact, mine. My head came up, but that wasn't the only thing that arrived, because I had smelled that scent before. Not recently, not here, 7 years ago in the dark, in a barn on enemy territory past the eastern border. I'd been 17, traveling without a guard, because I'd been arrogant enough to believe I didn't need one, and I'd paid for it. A territorial crossing gone wrong. 2 cracked ribs and an infected wound, and 3 days without water, waiting for the decision the pack holding me was going to make about what to do with an alpha's son caught on their land. I had been very calm about the likelihood of what that decision would be, and then a girl had slipped through the side door before dawn. Quiet. Fast. She hadn't spoken much. Just worked. Steady hands, a healer's efficiency, the water skin pressed into my hands with no ceremony. She'd cut the binding on my wrist where it had gone too tight. She'd left the east gate unlocked, and she had looked at me once, directly, with eyes the color of deep water, and said, "Go. Don't come back this way." I had made it out. I had tried to find her afterward, sent quiet inquiries through neutral channels, looking for a Packless healer girl near the eastern border, but going back to that territory directly would have started a war, and she had gone within days of my escape anyway. The trail had ended in nothing. I had carried the possibility that she was dead, alongside the possibility that she was alive and simply gone, and neither had gotten easier with time. I had carried her for 7 years, not as an obsession. As a debt I didn't know how to repay, and a face I hadn't been able to stop remembering. And as a quiet, low thing I had stopped naming, the hope that she was somewhere, still moving, still herself. And now she was standing in my hall in iron cuffs with mud on the hem of her cloak, and I understood, with a certainty that arrived before I was done assembling the evidence, that the moon had been paying attention. Mate. The word didn't present itself for consideration. It simply landed, deep and absolute and already true, and underneath it her, specifically, exactly, the girl who had saved my life without asking for anything in return. The court parted. I crossed the hall and stopped in front of her. Up close, every detail sharpened. The set of her jaw, the worn boots she'd clearly refused to give up, her eyes tracking me with calculation, and something underneath the calculation she wasn't quite managing to keep off her face. Not fear, not welcome, not anything she'd made peace with yet. She felt the bond. I could see her working through it, the wolf in her recognizing what the woman wasn't ready to acknowledge. I cupped her face. Carefully. One hand, fingers against her jaw. She went still the way something coiled goes still. Then I looked at my court. At Celeste, 3 feet to my left, her expression arranged into something that would pass for serene to anyone who didn't know how to look beneath it. This is my mate. She is mine by the moon's will. There is no negotiation after that sentence. No arrangement that supersedes a mate bond declared before an entire court. Every person in that hall knew it. I took her hand. Her fingers were cold. She'd been marching in the morning cold for hours. Her hand fit inside mine the way things that belong together find a way to fit. I led her through the hall. Behind me I heard the court recalibrating, the sound of 30 people quietly rearranging their understanding of what this kingdom had just become. What I did not yet know was what that recalibration was going to cost. In the corridor I stopped. The guards had removed the iron cuffs before we'd left the hall. I'd given the order without thinking about it. The way you give orders for things that should not require being said. A soldier had told me her name as we passed. Zoe. I said nothing in response. I turned it over once, quietly, to myself. Torchlight on her face. She hadn't spoken since the hall. She'd matched my pace with the composure of someone who had decided showing uncertainty wasn't an option, and she'd held it with an iron I found genuinely impressive. There was a strand of hair across her cheek. I moved it. She shivered, then looked as if she wished she hadn't. I'd spent 9 years carrying the weight of this kingdom. Every decision, every burden, everything that falls to the person at the top and stays there, because there's no one beside you to share it. Standing in that corridor with the bond humming between us, one thought landed cleanly: I have been waiting for you. Not only for the mate I hadn't found, for her, specifically, the girl who had looked at me dying in the dark and made a choice that cost her everything. I didn't say any of it. Too soon. I had already decided I was going to do this right. Slowly, with the patience she had already made clear she was going to require. She was not leaving this fortress. I'd decided that before I was halfway across the hall. What I hadn't decided was how to tell her I recognized her, or whether she would believe it, or what it would mean to her if she did. And what I hadn't decided was what to do about Celeste. The look she'd given Zoe over my shoulder was not a reaction. It was the opening of a campaign. I'd spent 9 years reading courts. I knew the difference. I had less time than I thought.
By morning I had already heard her. Before the household was fully awake, before the corridor fires had been fed past embers, Celeste's voice drifted under my door. Low, unhurried, speaking to someone I couldn't place through the wood. The words didn't carry. The tone did. It was the tone of someone giving instructions to a person who already knew what they were supposed to do and needed only the confirmation to start. I lay still and listened until the footsteps moved away. Then I got up. They'd given me a room with a real fire, thick wool rugs, and a window looking out over the courtyard. The attendant had dressed me in green wool and silver thread, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been briefed, and decided that competence was safer than warmth. I respected the calculation. I make the same one about most things. The dress fit, not approximately. Properly, as if someone had estimated my exact measurements before I arrived. Both options, well-stocked, wardrobe or deliberate preparation, required more thought than I currently had space for. I sat by the fire and turned over what I knew. A fortress full of people who had spent years expecting a different woman to become their Luna. A court that had adjusted every alliance around a plan that had just been thrown out. And somewhere in this building, a woman who had been standing so carefully near Andres that proximity had started to look like ownership. I had learned a long time ago, the people who smile while they're moving against you are always more dangerous than the ones who don't bother to smile. What came next was him. He knocked and then opened the door without waiting for an answer, which told me exactly how he understood the current arrangement. He came in carrying a wooden tray, bread, cheese, honeyed something in a small pot, a clay cup of wine that smelled like oak and something sweet. He looked at me in the green dress, and something in his expression settled, the way a breath settles after you've been holding it. He sat across from me on a three-legged stool. Not a chair. A stool, the kind the kitchen staff used. The Alpha King of Gonzales, on a three-legged stool in my chamber with bread and cheese. This was not in any version of this I had prepared for. We talked. He asked short questions and listened to the answers with the patience of a man who is genuinely building a picture, not filling time. When I said 7 years packless without elaborating, he didn't push. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you're calculating not what they're worth to you but what they've cost themselves. Under the table, his knee pressed against mine. Not deliberate, just there, warm and steady. He reached across and covered my hand with his. Not possessive, not demanding. Just present, like a door left open. Heat climbed my arm before I'd decided anything about it. I didn't pull away. I also didn't turn my hand over and hold his back. I sat with it, which felt like the only honest thing I could do with something I hadn't yet decided how to feel about. And I kept waiting for it, that look from the hall. The one that had landed differently than the bond should land, like recognition, not just instinct. He opened his mouth once, between questions, and then closed it. Not a pause, a stop. Like he had started something and pulled it back. He looked at my hands on the table instead, and whatever it was, he let it go. I decided I had imagined it. 7 years of watching for threats had a way of making you see things that weren't there. She arrived without warning, which I would later understand was always how she arrived. Celeste walked into my chamber like she'd simply remembered it existed and decided to visit. She took 3 steps inside and paused, her gaze moving around the room in a brief, thorough assessment that finished with me. "Oh," a smile arrived. "I didn't realize you had company." Then, before Andres could speak, "How lovely you look, Zoe, that green is very becoming." A small pause. "Soft wool suits you. Better than it would, I think, on someone who grew up with finer things. Strays rarely suit silk. They tend to look borrowed," said casually, observationally. A small thing dropped into the air and left to do its work. Andres frowned. He'd caught the shift in tone but not the content, because she had calibrated it precisely for that gap. I didn't let him speak. I looked at Celeste. Directly. The way I had learned to look at things I needed to understand clearly. Not hostile, not startled, just looking. Reading. 7 years of moving through territories where the danger didn't announce itself had given me one very specific skill. I could find the blade inside a pleasantry before it landed. And I could find the fear underneath the blade, which was more useful than either. Celeste was afraid. Not of me, not exactly. She was afraid of what I meant. And fear in someone like her, composed, strategic, long prepared, doesn't look like panic. It looks like calculation accelerating. I smiled back at her. Evenly, said nothing. She held my eyes for 1 beat too long. Something she hadn't planned for moved across her face. Quick, controlled, gone. Then she excused herself and left. After the door closed, Andres looked at me, working on the aftertaste of the last 30 seconds. "What was that?" "What did it sound like to you?" he considered. "A pleasantry." "Yes," I said. "That's what it was designed to sound like." He looked at me. The corner of his expression shifted, sharpening. I wasn't going to explain it further. Not yet. I didn't know this place's fault lines, didn't know which members of his council had spent 3 years expecting Celeste to become Luna, and were quietly still expecting it. I didn't know enough to spend information. What I knew was this: she had been in the corridor before dawn, giving instructions. She had walked into my room like it was already hers. She had said what she said with a perfect smile and left before anything could be asked of her. She wasn't testing me. She was beginning. Andres lifted my hand and pressed his lips to my knuckles. Soft and deliberate. "Rest well, my mate." He left. I sat in the firelight with his touch still warm on my hand and Celeste's expression in the back of my mind, not the smile, the thing that had been underneath, for just that 1 beat before she put it away. She was afraid, and she was moving fast, and I was the only one in this fortress who knew it. That needed to change.
I found the note under my solar door before dawn. No name, no seal, 3 words in careful handwriting. She does not belong. I held it over the fire until it was ash and sat watching the embers. Someone in this fortress had made a decision overnight, careful enough to leave no trace. That level of care told me 2 things. They weren't acting alone, and they didn't intend to stop with 1 note. I thought about Celeste. 3 years building her position in this court, carefully adjusting every alliance to accommodate the expectation that she would one day stand beside me. Those alliances didn't dissolve because I'd walked across a hall. They recalibrated. They waited for direction, and they were receiving it from somewhere. Javier, who had been at my side for 9 years and knew the texture of court trouble before it showed itself openly, had already started watching. But Celeste was not the only problem. My council was split. I had seen it in the hall, in the way certain members had exchanged looks during the declaration. 3 of them had staked their political futures on Celeste's position. If she fell, they fell with her. They had every reason to help her run down whatever ground she had left. 2 notes in 3 days was not a beginning. It was a tempo. I'd been too patient. Moving carefully while Celeste moved fast was not strategy. It was a gift I was handing her. I went to find Zoe in the morning. I found her in the herb garden, crouching near a row of sage, turning a sprig in her fingers with the focused attention of someone deciding how it might be useful. She'd changed into simple clothes, plain gray tunic, dark trousers, the worn boots she had clearly insisted on keeping. Good, they were hers. She was right to keep them. She heard me, straightened, turned with the reflexive readiness of someone who had learned not to be caught off guard. Then she saw it was me. The readiness shifted into something more guarded but less alarmed. That was something. With her, something was already a great deal. I held out my hand. She looked at it. She looked at me. She took it. We walked. I talked about what we passed. Not filling space, but sharing the way you share things with someone you want to know. She asked questions. Short ones first, precise and practical. Where the river marks the border, who maintains the east wall, how old is the south wing? The questions of someone building a map of territory she was going to have to know. Then the questions got longer. Less about the fortress and more about me. At one point, the cobblestones went uneven, and her foot caught. I had my arm around her waist before I'd consciously decided to move. She caught herself anyway, but she did not step away from the arm. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then she straightened, and we kept walking. We came to a stone bench in the morning light, and I stopped us there. She let me look at her. Looked back with the directness of someone who considers looking away a concession they're not prepared to make. I tipped her chin up with 2 fingers. Slowly. She did not move. I pressed my lips to her forehead. Held it for a moment, because it deserved to be held. When I stepped back, she had her eyes closed, her expression stripped of its usual calculation for just a second. Then she recollected herself and looked at me with something that was trying to be measured and was not entirely succeeding. I offered my hand again. She took it. We walked back through the herb garden in the morning light, and I thought about what I was still carrying. The recognition I hadn't spoken yet. The thing I owed her. The fact that she had saved my life and never received so much as an acknowledgement for it. Had, instead, lost everything because of it. She deserved to know, I remembered. She deserved to know that the debt had never left me. I had almost said it at the bench. The words had been there, formed and ready. And then she had looked at me with her eyes still half closed and that stripped expression on her face, the one she never meant to show. And I had understood that I was afraid. Not that she would run. That she would hear it as obligation. That she would fold everything I was trying to build into something that felt like repayment and nothing more. And I would have no way to argue otherwise when I had waited this long to say it. So I had held it again. 1 more day. I would know when the time was right. The ash in my solar was still waiting. I had 1 name in my head. I'd had it since the first morning. The question was how fast Celeste would move, and how many of my own council would move with her.
I found the flower on my windowsill when I came back from the morning walk, small, pale, placed deliberately in a cup of water that hadn't been there when I left. No note. Someone had been in my room while I was gone. I stood in the doorway and looked at it. It could have been innocent, but I had heard Celeste's voice in the corridor before dawn, and I knew how innocent her gestures were. I put the flower in my pocket. Later, I would learn it was from a small boy named Bryn who helped at the horses. I had already noticed him. He had appeared at the edge of the herb garden that morning while Andres and I walked, half hidden behind a stone wall, watching with the focused attention of a child who has decided something is important and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. When I had looked directly at him, he had gone very still, then disappeared around the corner. Not afraid, just not ready. The pale flower on my windowsill, a spray of purple from the kitchen garden the day before, a smooth flat stone he'd clearly been carrying for some time. Gifts delivered with the solemnity of a child making an offering, then fled before anyone could respond. I had put each one somewhere visible. I was not going to pretend they didn't matter. That evening I went down to the feast. Long tables, good candles, a seating arrangement that communicated everything a court communicates through placement. I'd been reading it since I arrived. Who defers? Who pretends to defer while doing something else, where the weight actually sits? Tonight Andres seated me at his right hand. In pack hierarchy, the right hand is specific language. It said, "The matter is settled. If you missed the announcement 3 days ago, here is your reminder in the form of a chair." The feast moved through its courses. I listened. The sidelong conversations in my half of the table, the ones pitched low but not low enough, I caught all of them. I always have. It's the same skill that let me hear Celeste in the corridor before dawn. Andres spoke to me between courses, small things. A dry observation about one of his council members, shared in the tone of someone letting you into a room they don't usually open. I answered. I almost laughed at one of them, which surprised me enough that I had to look away before it showed. Across the table and 3 seats down sat a woman who had not spoken to me once since I arrived. Senior pack, by the way, everyone angled toward her without appearing to. She watched me the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. Not hostile, not warm, just measuring. When I glanced at her directly, she held my eyes for a beat, then looked away first. Not deference. Assessment, not yet complete. Celeste sat 4 places down on the opposite side. She had been giving the man beside her warm, animated attention all evening. She'd looked over at us exactly twice. But the man she was speaking to, I'd watched him across 3 days of court. He was one of the senior council members, one of the ones whose face had gone carefully blank when Andres declared me mate. She wasn't entertaining him, she was working him. I watched her the way I watch things I haven't fully understood yet. The 3rd course arrived when it happened. A full goblet of wine, tipped at my shoulder from the left. Deep red across the front of the cream fabric I'd been given for the evening. A beat of silence. Then laughter from the section of the table nearest Celeste, rippling outward with the ease of people who had learned to follow her lead on what required a social response. I looked at the servant. His hands were perfectly steady. He had not fumbled anything. I looked down the table. Celeste looked back with her brows slightly raised, her expression doing something so precisely calibrated to sympathy I could have admired it under other circumstances. Oh, how dreadful. Wine is so unforgiving on light fabric. I excused myself, set my napkin down with care. Walked out without hurrying because hurrying was the second part of what the moment was designed to produce. Back in my chamber, I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. The bodice was ruined. I knew that before I'd made it up the stairs. I got up anyway, found a cloth, started scrubbing. The wine had already set. I kept scrubbing until my fingers went red, because there are things I can't fix that I refuse to stop trying to fix, and sometimes that stubbornness is the only thing I have left. And there it was. The thing I'd been pushing down since the corridor before dawn, since the flower in the cup, since Celeste's eyes over Andres' shoulder. I was scared. Not of the wine or the whispers or the perfectly timed cruelty of someone who had practiced her weapons until they were invisible. I was scared of needing something I couldn't carry alone, and it landing here, in a place I hadn't chosen, with a man I hadn't planned for, surrounded by people who had already decided I didn't belong. Packless wolves don't get fated mates. I had built 7 years around that. And now my fingers were red from scrubbing a ruined dress in an unfamiliar room, and I was crying. Quietly and without permission, with no one watching and no one coming. And underneath the crying, that question again, the one I couldn't stop, if not for the bond. Would any of this be happening? Would he have walked across that hall for me, specifically packless and cuffed and nobody, if the moon hadn't made him? I didn't know. I had no way of knowing, and I had learned, at 16, what it cost to believe something that turns out not to be true. I sat on the floor and let it go for exactly as long as I could afford to. Then I dried my face. I breathed. I was still standing, or close enough. He came through the door and saw me on the floor with the cloth and the stain and the state of my hands. His face did something I didn't have a name for, something angrier than pity, and more careful. He crossed the room. He kneeled in front of me. He took the cloth out of my hands. I let him. He wiped my hands clean. Then he set the cloth aside and pulled me into his lap. I put my face against his neck. He was warm. The bond settled into the contact the way something settles when it's finally found its place. And I didn't have a framework for that word applied to another person, and I was going to have to figure out what to do with it. His hand moved through my hair. I'm sorry, the court should know better. He didn't say it was an accident. The apology he chose was for behavior under his authority. He'd understood the shape of it before he'd come through the door. His lips found my temple, my cheek, the corner of my mouth, asking nothing. I turned my face toward his, just slightly. The kiss was soft and lingering, and when it ended, he pressed his forehead to mine and neither of us moved. I pressed my face back into his neck and stayed where I was. I had not told him about the flower, had not told him about the footsteps before dawn, about the instructions in the corridor. I had been handling it the way I handle everything, alone, quietly, without asking anyone for help I wasn't sure they'd give. That was a serious mistake, and I was starting to run out of time to correct it.
I found the second note tucked into the frame of the garden gate she used most. Same careful handwriting. She will ruin everything you have built. I held it in my closed fist for the entire walk to the council chamber. 2 notes in 3 days. The wine at the feast. Zoe managing all of it alone, holding her composure with the practiced discipline of someone who had survived 7 years by never letting anything show. That evening, the council meeting confirmed what I had suspected. Councillor Marin, 3 years aligned with Celeste's future position, 3 years building a network inside this court that answered to her interests, had been quiet in a way that was not neutrality. It was the quiet of a man watching the board and deciding whether his next move should be visible. I had been watching Celeste. I should have been watching Marin. After the meeting, I sent for Javier. Find out what Marin has been discussing privately for the last 4 days. Find out who was holding the goblet at the feast. And find out what Celeste has been doing before dawn. Javier looked at me. How far do you want me to go? As far as it takes. I had been too slow. I had burned notes and moved carefully and given Zoe time to arrive at this place on her own terms, and while I was doing that, Celeste had not been giving anyone time at all. That was not going to continue. Walk with me. A beat. Then she stepped out. I led her through the east passage and out through the gate to the rose garden. My grandmother planted the original stock. My mother added the second row. In summer, it's almost too much. In early spring, it's stripped back to structure, dark canes and thorns and the suggestion of what it will become, under a sky full of stars and a moon 3/4 full. Zoe looked up when we came out from under the gatehouse arch. For a moment her face was open, unguarded, the expression of someone who had stopped paying attention to armor and had simply reacted. I draped a wolf fur cloak over her shoulders. She pulled it around herself without comment. We walked. At first in silence, which was fine. We had learned each other's silences in 5 days. Her silences are inhabited. She is thinking in them, running the numbers on whatever she is watching. Mine are similar. She asked about the garden. I told her about my grandmother, a woman who had run this kingdom for 11 years after my grandfather died and before my father was old enough to assume it. A woman who had understood that choosing to make something grow when everything else was hard was its own kind of argument. An argument for what? That things worth having require patience, and the willingness to let them grow on their own schedule. A quiet moment. Is that what you're doing? With me? Yes. She nodded once, the nod of someone deciding whether to trust an answer. We came to the ancient oak at the center of the garden. I stopped. I turned her to face me. Her chin came up. The reflex so ingrained it was probably there before she was old enough to understand why she needed it. I never wanted Celeste. She held very still. I know what it must look like from where you're standing. An arrangement in place for years, a woman prepared for the position, a court that had adjusted every expectation accordingly. I know it looks like I had a plan, and then you arrived and the plan changed. I looked at her directly. The moonlight through the rose canes made patterns across the ground between us. 3 feet. 2. The bond pulled at both of us like a tide that didn't care what time we had decided to take. What is true is that I was fulfilling a duty I was told I had, because I didn't know this was possible. That there would be a person. That I would see them across a hall and everything that had been obligation would become beside the point. Her face stripped down just for a moment, long enough. I want you, Zoe, not the position, not the utility of the bond, you specifically. I drew her in, hands at her waist, careful, giving her every chance to step back. She rose on her toes. We kissed for the first time under the old oak, in the early spring dark, the bond humming between us, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be acknowledged. When we pulled apart, she had her eyes closed, not armored, not calculating, just here. I pressed my lips to her forehead, her temple, the curve of her cheek. She opened her eyes, and for the first time since I had walked off the dais, she smiled. A real one, small and startled, arriving before she had decided to allow it. I took her hand, and we walked back through the rose garden under the moon, and for the first time in 9 years the weight I carried did not feel entirely like mine alone. I did not see in the shadows near the gatehouse arch the figure standing there, watching, the hem of embroidered velvet disappearing through the door just before we reached it. I would not know until it was already too late.
I found her in the corridor. Not planned. I had been on my way to the herb garden in the early morning when I turned the corner, and there she was. Celeste, alone, standing at the passage window with a cup of something warm, watching the courtyard below. No arranged scene, no audience. Just the two of us in a corridor that was still too quiet for the day to have properly started. She heard my step, turned. We looked at each other. This was the moment, and we both knew it. The wine at the feast, the footsteps before dawn, the flower in my room. Everything she had done with a smile on her face and an audience watching, everything calculated to land without leaving a mark. Not this morning. I think we should speak plainly, I said, since we're here. Her chin came up, the practiced angle. I have nothing but goodwill toward you. I know that's what you've decided to believe. I took a step toward her, not threatening, just closing the distance she liked to have, the space she used to control a room. And I understand why the arrangement you had in mind for years was disrupted by something you didn't plan for. I understand that this has been hard. Something moved in her face, careful, controlled. What I need you to understand, I continued, is that I have spent 7 years reading people in rooms where getting it wrong meant losing everything. I know what you're doing. I know how you're doing it. I know which member of the household you spoke to before dawn on the second morning. I know who was holding the goblet at the feast. A pause. And I know you were standing at the gatehouse arch last night. The composure held, but underneath it the calculation ran fast. I could see it, the way I can always see it, the way 7 years of watching dangerous people manage their faces had made me very good at finding the thing they are managing. She was afraid, not of me, of what I meant, that I was here, that he had chosen, that this wasn't going to reverse itself no matter how careful or persistent she was. What are you going to do? She said, still even, still very good at her own voice. Nothing. I held her eyes. I don't have to. I just needed you to know that I see it, all of it. I let that sit for a breath. You are very good at what you do, but I am better at watching people than you are at hiding from being watched. She didn't answer. I walked past her down the corridor. My hands were steady, my face was steady. I was aware, somewhere very deep and very quiet, that I had just done something I could not take back, that I had shown Celeste I knew, and that knowing I knew might make her careful. Or it might make her faster. I had been counting on the first, but I had been in enough rooms to know it was usually the second.
By the time I reached the corridor outside her door, 3 council members had stepped into my path with the same careful argument that the confinement had been a reasonable precaution, that the situation was still developing, that I should wait. I had not stopped walking once. I had come back from the Eastern Border meeting 2 hours early because something had not settled right all morning. Not the meeting. Something in the bond. A pull that felt muted, held at arm's length. Not alarm exactly, but off. Wrong in the quiet way that wrong things sometimes present before they announce themselves. I rode through the gates and Javier fell into step beside me before I'd crossed the courtyard. What happened? A child from the stables, missing since dawn. The household confined your mate to her rooms. For her safety, they said. I stopped walking. Who gave that order? No one official. Passed through the household staff in pieces so that no single person gave it cleanly. A pause, and something in Javier's voice that wasn't quite steady. The boy has been found, but not sleeping behind barrels, as we were first told. He was found locked in the grain stores on the far side of the fortress, a storage room that requires a key. One of the senior kitchen staff had it. The air in the courtyard went cold. He was locked in. Frightened, crying. He'd been there since before first light. Javier looked at me directly. It was not a misadventure with a cat. I assembled the shape of it as I moved. Bryn, the small boy who had been appearing at the edges of Zoe's walks, leaving her things, appointing himself her unofficial companion. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen what Bryn represented to her, the first thread of belonging she had allowed herself in this fortress, and had removed him. Not to hurt the child, to use him. To manufacture a crisis. Timed for a morning I was away from the main building. A packless wolf in a fortress she'd been in for less than 2 weeks. The missing child already connected to her in every servant's mind before the search had even begun. It was deliberate. It was exact. And Marin's name surfaced alongside Celeste's, the 2 of them moving in tandem, the political and the personal aligned against one woman who had no backing, no family, no history in this place to draw on. I had been too slow. That was not going to continue. I knocked once on her door, then went in. She was on the window seat, knees drawn up, back straight, watching the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting and had already decided how they were going to present themselves when the waiting ended. Eyes clear, hands still in her lap, the afternoon tray on the table beside her, untouched. She had been in this room for hours, alone, holding herself together with the discipline of someone who had spent 7 years making sure no one could see her come undone. I crossed the room in 4 steps and kneeled in front of her. Are you hurt? No. Are you frightened? A beat? Honest? I was, a little. I gathered her close. Not careful, not measured. My arms around her, her face against my shoulder. Her fingers found the front of my coat and held on. I knew you were coming back, she said. I just had to wait. Something in my chest did something complicated. You should not have had to wait at all. I pulled back enough to see her face. I kissed her once, because I needed her to have it. Then I looked at her. This will not happen again. Not this. Not any version of this. Never again. Her eyes held mine. I know, she said, and I could see her deciding carefully to believe it. There is a specific kind of courage in that. In choosing to believe something when every previous version of that choice has cost you something. She'd been given reasons not to trust alphas, not to trust authority, not to trust a room she couldn't exit freely. And here she was, looking at me with clear eyes from a room she hadn't been able to leave, choosing. I pressed my lips to her forehead and held them there. Then I stood. There was something I had to attend to. It had been waiting too long to be properly ended. But there was something else waiting too, something I owed her that had nothing to do with Celeste or the court or any of the rest of it. I had told myself I would wait until she trusted this enough to hear it. I had told myself it wasn't the right moment, that it was too soon, that she would run. Watching her in that window seat, her face clear and her hands still and the door held at arm's length because she had trusted me to come back, I understood that I had been cowardly, that I had been protecting myself from her reaction, not protecting her from the information. tonight, after the rest of it was done, I was going to tell her. She was already in the hall when I entered. Celeste, standing in the same position she'd occupied the day Zoe arrived, embroidered velvet, chin at the practiced angle. The full arrangement of a woman who had prepared herself for a difficult scene and was confident in her ability to manage it. I took my seat. The council was in their chairs. The senior warriors were along the walls. The household staff who had made decisions that morning were present. I had made sure of that specifically. Councillor Marin was 3 seats to my left. His face gave nothing away. I kept him in my periphery. I looked at the room. Then I named it, all of it, item by item, in the flat specific way that leaves no room for reinterpretation. The wine at the feast. The servant whose hands had been perfectly steady. The pocket of laughter from the section of the table that had spent 3 years aligned with Celeste's interests. The words chosen for a corridor she had known would carry. Novelty. Charity. He will tire of it. 2 notes appearing in careful, traceless handwriting under my door and in the gate frame Zoe used most. A child taken from the stables before first light. Locked in a storage room on the far side of the fortress with the key held by someone who reported upward to a very specific person in this household. The child found frightened and crying, not sleeping peacefully, which is what we had been told, which was its own evidence of how long this had been planned and how carefully the story had been prepared in advance. My mate, alone in a room for half a day, confined on the basis of an emergency that had been manufactured before she had done a single thing wrong. I did not raise my voice. The quieter the delivery, the more clearly a thing is heard. The council was very still. The warriors were very still. Celeste was still. Marin did not move, but something behind his eyes did, a very fast, very private calculation arriving at a conclusion. These were not accidents. They were a campaign, conducted against my mate in my house, while I trusted that the terms of release I had offered were being honored in good faith. Celeste found her moment. You are describing intentions I do not have. I have shown your mate nothing but courtesy. You have shown her everything except that, and you did it carefully enough that you believed I would not trace the line of it back to you. Something shifted in her face. The composure held, but underneath it the calculation ran, and found nothing left to calculate with. I was meant to be Luna. You were never going to be Luna. That was a plan made in the absence of a mate, and it was always conditional on that absence. The absence ended. You were released from the arrangement with what I believed was good faith. What has happened in the days since has told me I was wrong about that. Silence. You will leave Gonzalez territory before moonrise tonight. Your family will be notified. You will be treated with dignity in the departure, which is more consideration than was extended to my mate or to a small child locked in a dark room. This is the final word on the matter. She looked at my face. She didn't say anything. She left the hall without a sound. Her chin was still at the practiced angle. The composure she had worn every day since Zoe arrived held to the very end. But I was not naive enough to think her departure ended it. Her family held 2 territories to the east. Her father sat on the regional council. The alliances she had spent 3 years building inside this court did not evaporate because she walked out a door. Celeste leaving was the end of a chapter. Not the end of the story. I looked at Marin. He looked back at me. Something passed between us that was not a confrontation yet, but was the clear acknowledgement that one was coming. Not tonight. I stood. My mate is the Luna of this pack. She will be treated accordingly. Anyone who finds this unclear is welcome to seek their future elsewhere. No one said anything. I went to find Zoe. She was at the bottom of the staircase. She had heard the court assembled and come down on her own, standing with her arms at her sides and her chin up and her eyes on the hall doors. Waiting. Still waiting, because that was who she was. I crossed to her and took her hand. Then I turned to the court assembled in the corridor behind me. I drew her forward and kissed her, fully, in front of all of them, deep and certain, my hand on her face, her hand at my chest. The bond warm with the thing that had been declared and was now being declared again, without reservation for anyone who had managed to miss it the first time. The hall erupted. Not the stunned silence of the first morning. Something warmer and louder, and entirely different, the pack finding its voice around the thing it had decided to follow. She was laughing when we broke apart, startled and warm and real. I pressed my forehead to hers. That is what certain looks like.
We were in his chambers. I remember the corridor after the hall, the pack still loud behind us, his hand in mine and his grip certain. The staircase, the door, the fire already burning, because someone in this fortress anticipates things with uncanny accuracy. And then I was sitting on the edge of a large chair with my hands in my lap, and the room was very quiet. And it arrived again. Not the quiet cry of the ruined dress in the empty chamber. Different now. This one came from the chest opening, from being safe enough finally to fall apart completely. The kind of crying that has been waiting patiently while you kept your chin up and your voice even and your hands from shaking, and then finds the first moment when it is actually safe. I put my face in my hands. He sat in front of me. His hands found my wrists gently and drew my hands down, and then he pulled me against him and held me. He did not say it was over, did not tell me I was safe now. He just held me, steady and warm, one hand on my back and one in my hair, and let it go on for as long as it needed to. It went on for a while. When it quieted, I became aware of the fire and the room, and the dampness on his shoulder, and the fact that his arm hadn't loosened once. I do not usually do that. I know, it has been a long 10 days. Yes. I sat up enough to see his face. He looked at me the way he always looks at me, steady, patient, like there is no version of this that would make him want to be somewhere else. I was so angry in that room. I spent 7 years making sure no one could ever put me somewhere and lock the door. And then I walked into this fortress and let it happen. I just waited. You trusted me. That is not the same as letting something happen to you. That is a choice, a hard one for someone who has been on their own as long as you have. I looked at the fire for a moment and thought about that. And then he said, "There is something I have to tell you." I looked at him. His expression had changed. Still steady, still him, but underneath it something I hadn't seen before, something careful and old and braced. 7 years ago, eastern border, an enemy pack's territory past the border I'd been told not to cross alone. The air went out of the room. I knew, before he finished the sentence. I knew from the way he was looking at me. Not the look of a man telling a story. The look of a man confessing a debt. There was a girl, he said, 16. Healer's hands, eyes the color of deep water. She slipped into a barn before dawn and unlocked a gate and saved my life. I sat very still. I recognized you the moment you walked into the hall. Not just the bond, you. I have been carrying you for 7 years. I looked for you after. I couldn't go back to the territory without starting a war, but I tried. I learned you'd gone packless and the trail went cold. I didn't know if you were alive. And then you were standing in iron cuffs in my hall and He stopped, looked at me. I need you to know, the bond is real, but it found something that was already there. I would have sought you out, Zoe, without the moon's hand in it. I had been trying to for years. It has always been you specifically, not the mate I hadn't found. You. I didn't say anything for a long time. There was a thing in my throat that I couldn't name, something between grief and relief, and the very specific ache of a debt paid so late the person who carried it had almost stopped believing it would ever come. I had lost my pack for him. I had lost my home and my name and 7 years of belonging for a boy I had helped survive in the dark and never seen again. And he had remembered. He had always remembered. He had looked for me. I lost everything, I said. My voice was even, barely. My pack, my place, everything I had, because I unlocked that gate. I know, he said, and the weight in those 2 words was not nothing. It was a man who had carried the understanding of that cost for years and had never been able to do anything about it. I know what it cost. I have known for a long time. I never found a way to believe I deserved what I owed you. The thing in my throat broke loose. I didn't cry this time. Something else happened, something quieter and more complete. The question I had been carrying since the hall, would he choose me without the bond? Does he see me or only what the moon put in front of him? Didn't disappear. It answered itself. He had been looking for me for 7 years. He had known me before the bond existed between us. That was not obligation. That was not the moon. That was choice. Why didn't you tell me, I said. Not an accusation, a real question. He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid you'd hear it as a debt I was paying, that you'd fold everything I wanted to be into something that felt like repayment, and I'd have no way to argue otherwise when I had waited so long to say it. I looked at him, thought about that. That's almost exactly what I was afraid of too, I said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, something quieter. I reached up and put my hand against his face. He covered it with his and held it there, and neither of us moved for a long time. I'm staying. A beat. I decided somewhere around the rose garden, but I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I'm ready now, I am staying. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then his hands came up to my face, slow, and he kissed me. Different from the kiss in the corridor in front of everyone. That one had been a declaration. This was something smaller and more private, and deeper for it. The kind of kiss that happens after the real conversation, not before it. When we pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to mine. Good, he said, one word, carrying approximately everything. The evening went on, the fire went down, and we let it. We stayed in chairs pulled close and talked the way we hadn't yet had the space or quiet to do. He told me about the kingdom, the parts that were hard, things he hadn't told his council. I told him about the territories I'd passed through, the close calls, the things I'd thought I would do when I was old enough to stop running. It was strange to say those things out loud. I had carried them for so long in the silence of moving that giving them language felt like setting something down I hadn't known I was still holding. He listened. He asked questions. He didn't offer solutions or reassurances. He just listened, and the listening was its own kind of answer. Somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I was not performing composure anymore. Not tracking exits or managing impressions or holding any part of myself in the careful reserve that had become so habitual I'd stopped noticing I was doing it. I was just sitting in a chair with a man I had known for 10 days, telling him the truth about myself. It did not feel like a liability. His hand found mine on the armrest. I turned it over and held his back. He looked at our hands with the expression of a man who has received something he wasn't expecting and doesn't quite know what to do with that yet. I knew exactly how he felt. The Eastern delegation arrived on a Tuesday, which is the sort of detail that later feels like it should have announced itself more dramatically. 3 representatives from Celeste's father's territory, here to discuss what they called a disruption to previously established diplomatic arrangements. They were escorted to the council room with the courtesy afforded to people who have come to complain about something they cannot actually reverse but intend to complain about thoroughly anyway. I was not invited to the meeting. That was deliberate, not Andres' deliberateness, but the council's. Marin had arranged the schedule. The subtext was clear. This is political. This is not for her. I went to the herb garden and thought about it. I had healer's knowledge. I had 7 years of moving through territories where knowing what a plant could do was the difference between useful and useless. There was a child in the infirmary who had been running a fever for 3 days that the fortress healer was managing with poultices and prayer. I had watched her work the day before and held my mouth shut because I was the alpha's mate and no one had asked me. I went to the infirmary. The healer, a woman named Esther, sharp-eyed and deeply skeptical of unsolicited input, looked at me when I walked in. The fever isn't breaking because the poultice isn't drawing the infection, I said. There's a yarrow and willow bark combination that works faster. I can show you, or I can step back. I didn't come to take over. I came because I know the plant and the child has been sick for 3 days. A long pause. Then Esther handed me the mortar. The child's fever broke by evening. Esther didn't say much, but she didn't ask me to leave either, and when I came back the next morning she had already set out the yarrow. I did not do it for the court. I did not do it to earn anything. But the woman who had watched me across the feast table, the one who had never spoken to me, who had spent days measuring and not yet deciding, had been in the infirmary doorway for some of it. I had not acknowledged her. She had not come in. When the child's fever broke and I looked up, she was gone. I was not invited to the delegation meeting. Andres told me afterward what they had said, that the mate bond was acknowledged, but that long-standing diplomatic arrangements had been built on certain expectations, and those expectations had value that deserved recognition. What they meant was, Celeste's family wanted something in exchange for losing what they had been promised. Andres had told them he would consider the Eastern trade arrangements. He had not promised anything. They had left dissatisfied, which was the best outcome available. Marin had submitted his resignation from the council that afternoon, not gracefully, but submitted. The Eastern alliances were not broken, they were strained. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at me. "Does that frighten you?" I thought about it honestly. Less than it did. I paused. I lost everything once because I made a choice I believed in. I survived it. If the cost of being here is political difficulty and a man who won't resign cleanly, I shrugged. I've managed worse. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile. Something quieter and more permanent. He pulled me in by the waist and pressed his lips to my temple. "Yes," he said against my hair. "You have." The ceremony of Gonzales is old, short, spoken in the old language, conducted under a full moon when possible. Tonight it was possible. I had chosen silver and black. Not because anyone suggested them. Silver was the color of the moon under which mates are recognized. Black was the color of every night I had spent alone in territories that were not mine, moving through the dark with nothing but myself and the next direction I had decided to go. Together they felt like the truest thing I could wear to a ceremony about becoming, finally, something I had never been. Claimed, named, rooted. The woman from the feast table appeared at my elbow in the chamber doorway, the one who had watched from the infirmary doorway and said nothing, who had been measuring me for 2 weeks with the patience of someone who was not going to be hurried into a conclusion. I had never learned her name until Andres had mentioned it the day before. Lucy, Senior Pack, 20 years at this fortress. Her opinion, he had said, carries. She was looking out at the courtyard transformed with torchlight and early spring flowers that had no business blooming yet and had been coaxed into it anyway. "You look right," she said, like she was slightly surprised. "Thank you. I was not sure at first. I know. You are going to be a very inconvenient Luna." I looked at her. "Good," she said, and walked away. Andres was at the center of it, the way he is always at the center of things. Not by arrangement, but by gravity. Deep gray, unadorned, his hair back, watching me come down the stairs with the expression he has when he is feeling something he hasn't yet decided to name. I walked to him. He held out his hand. I took it. He spoke the words. I spoke the words that answered them. He lifted the circlet. Silver and dark stone, simple, made in the 3 days since I had said silver and black. He placed it on my brow carefully, his hands in my hair for a moment, adjusting, fingers warm against my temple. Then he looked at me with the face from the rose garden, the one without armor. He kissed me before the kneeling pack, under the full moon. The pack responded with a sound that rose from the ground up, several hundred wolves acknowledging something they had decided to follow. I pressed up on my toes and kissed him again briefly, because I could and because I wanted to, and because those two things were finally the same thing. The pack made the noise again, warmer. 3 months later, I stood on the balcony off our chambers in the early morning, the valley still in shadow, the sun just beginning to clear the far hills. He was behind me, his arm around my waist, his chin at my temple. He had council at mid-morning and a border report to review and other things on his list for the day. He was here anyway. He was always here anyway in this particular morning hour, before the day claimed us. "What are you thinking about?" His voice is quieter in the morning. Less king, more just him. The courtyard, the first day, I walked in with a speech about how useful I could be. 3 different versions. I would have liked to hear them. I laughed. His arm tightened around my waist. I was so sure I would talk my way out. And then you walked off that dais and all of it just went away. All 3 versions. I'm glad. So am I. The valley finished its turn from shadow to gold. I thought about the 14 of us in iron cuffs, not a year ago. About the speeches I had prepared, and the 7 years of territories that were not mine, and the girl who had decided, at 16, that packless wolves do not get fated mates, and had built her entire life carefully around that fact. That girl had walked into a hall ready to barter her freedom with words. She had not expected any of this. I turned in his arms to face him. His eyes in the early light were the same dark brown they had been across 30 feet of stone floor on the first morning. Looking at me the way he had looked at me before he had any particular reason to. Steady, without reservation, like the decision had already been made and there was nothing left to reconsider. I was always yours, I said. He looked at me for a moment. I know, he said, and then quieter, so was I. He kissed me once, soft in the warm light. Below us the fortress was waking up with the purposeful noise of a place that had work to do. The training yard, the kitchen, Javier already at the war table. Lucy already managing something no one had asked her to manage. The pack doing what packs do when they have decided, collectively, that the thing they are organized around is worth organizing around. I had walked into a hall with 3 speeches. Now I was standing on a balcony watching my valley go gold in the morning light with his arm around my waist and his lips at my temple. And the only thing I wanted to do with any of the speeches was laugh. We stayed a little while longer anyway. The sun had cleared the hilltops. The valley was fully gold. The fortress below us was alive with the noise of the day. I had run out of road here. I was glad I had.